Clarity by Dragon's Sin, Chapter 14, Part 2. I can't believe you. Weiss threw her hands up and threw herself out of the elevator as the door finally opened on the ground floor. Do you realize we were in the elevator for an hour going up and down? That's more than the commute into Vale. Oh, don't be like that. Ruby dismissed politely. Hey, maybe we can make it in time for lunch. You literally just ate a box of donuts on the ride down. Weiss hissed, but ready to bite her captain with how at her wits' end she was at, not to mention hungry. Seeing Ruby wolf down that entire box of donuts was more appetite whetting than she'd admit. Where did you even get them? Ruby's shrug only served to irritate her partner more. Figuring you couldn't win them all, Ruby went in for another bite, but she found herself lacking necessary air. Oh, Ruby, I'm so glad you're okay. Nora had arrived. The scythe user flailed her hands out in panic as the hammer-wielding titaness twirled her around like her weapon. In fact, Ruby probably weighed less than her hammer, so it was more violent than many roller coasters the huntress had ridden on. Nora, you did this before when you saw her earlier, Ren pointed out from within his palm. But I need her to know how much I missed her. As if affection were an exercise, Nora gave the girl another rip. Ruby reached out a hand towards her friends in panic, desperation. Why was no one stopping this? I'm pretty sure she gets it, John added as everyone watched the young girl's red theme change into blue. Now it was turning purple. Let her go, Nora. By some miracle, the murderously affectionate girl listened and terminated the embrace with an emphasized sigh. Ruby herself began gulping down sweet, sweet air, so much tastier than those donuts she'd scarfed. After going back to red, she turned with the two kinds of stares in her eyes to see her savior, Cardin Winchester. Suddenly, Ruby felt like suffocating was a better option. What do you want? Sounding less enthused than a sugar crash, Ruby did her best to keep hostility out of her voice, though Carden didn't flinch from the hostile gaze, simply meeting it with his own expression that was plainer than unbeaten toast. Then, just as abruptly as he arrived, the huntsman slipped away with his team. Glad you're okay, Shrimp, Carden muttered, almost imperceptible as he passed, not bothering to look at the girl. Ruby was utterly confused. What just happened? Honestly, we still don't know, Pyra lamented, looking after the retreating huntsmen, who were acting a good deal more dignified than normal. Ever since the incident, he's been acting different. The incident? Oh, when she got stranded. That seemed like an appropriate name, she supposed, though it was weird hearing it in reference to herself. Not like he's the only one, Yang muttered cryptically, Ruby craning her neck to look over at her sister in confusion. What did she mean? It didn't take long to receive an answer. As soon as they entered the cafeteria, Ruby was swarmed by people who all wanted her attention. The girls didn't stand a chance as she found herself swept away from her friends in a sea of students. Hey, look, it's Ruby. Wait, the girl that got kidnapped? No, you idiot. She told she took out one of those assassins. Wait, this shrimp shut it, moron. I'm sorry about my friend. How are you, Ruby? I'm glad you're okay. Was it scary? What were the assassins like? I heard they're like ninjas. Dude, you've got to be freaking awesome to take them on. Did you kill them? Alright, that's enough. All told, Ruby would have been grateful to her rescuer, even if they did lift her out of the flood of questions like a sack of flour and set her down like a teacup on a table far away from the mob. You're right there, champ. However, Ruby was just too blindsided to answer the girl in the beret with anything more than wavering, uh-huh, which probably wasn't even true. She might have been out of the crowd's grasp, but their questions clung to her skin like duct tape. They sealed her lips shut, and every time she tried to remove one of them from her mind, it felt like it was tearing a bit of the truth with it. Hey, you did good, for a kid, I mean. The woman, who looked like she was personally assembled by a professional seamstress, gave Ruby a million smile. Everything about her looked more well polished. She was older than Ruby, clearly older than her sister. Second, perhaps even a third year student with all that entailed should be able to handle a little bit of fame then, huh? Uh-huh. Coco chuckled and Ruby sighed. I get it, kid. Rabbit fans are worse than all the Black Friday shoppers and fashion posters combined. But you're the real deal. You stood up to the assassins. Most people here think that they know what they would do if they came face to face with those guys. Most of them are wrong. It's all well and good fighting Grim, but put him up against another person, they'll freeze, but not you. Or even if you do, you got past it and fought back. Hey, all you vultures and two-faces who can't apply a foundation right, listen up. Coco got up, dragging Ruby with her so that they both stood on one of the lunchroom tables that had been until that moment like a raft. Now it was a soapbox, the senior huntress holding Ruby by the scruff out in front of her like a lion cub. See this girl? Just a few weeks ago you were all talking behind her back about how a kid like her shouldn't be here. Well, you know what? I think she's more than proven she'd be here. She deserves. No, we need her here. We all need a good dose of humility, and I include myself, 'cause all y'all know that I'm not exactly subtle. Understatement of the year, the first year student was searching the enraptured crowd desperately for her own comrades, only to find them crawling away at the fringes trying to rescue her from the upperclassmen. But you know who are the assassins. They've already gotten into your heads, making themselves out to be like ghosts or demons or something. That's bull. They're human as you or I, or hell, Faunus, because that doesn't have a difference to them. And you know what? It shouldn't make a difference to us either. All this hate between species, competition between classes, it's all BS. This girl just proved that green first year has more balls than someone like Daichi. Sorry, yachts. Following the woman's thumb back, Ruby found a veritable giant standing behind them. He must have been the one who tossed her around like a hacky sack and now glanced down at her with eyes that were soft as a sewed sofa. We're all here for the same purpose, right? To become huntsmen and huntresses, no. To preserve our way of life, the things we take for granted on a day-to-day like going shopping without a worry, watching a movie with friends without being afraid of the lights going off, to protect people. Look around you now. These people next to you are the ones that you'll be protecting, who will protect you. To Ruby's astonishment, under her feet and her eyes, the students did indeed look at one another, and the fondness met the eyes of those who were formerly prejudiced to them. Everyone here has a reason to trust the ones next to them because each of you have more in common with one another than those murderers. And make no mistake, they won't give a shit whether you're young, old, boy, or girl, human, or faunus. Hearing this fearful rhetoric, the crowd of students visibly seemed to close ranks, making it all the harder for her friends to get through the blockade. But will we even have a chance against them? One student asked fearfully, though he was braver than most, who were merely thinking it. Oh, you can bet your ass we'll be ready for them next time. And Coco nodded, hooking her arm around Ruby and holding her there like a totem of strength. And it worked. The students around them gained a determined expression as they all seemed to fall into a sync, heads nodding like sine waves. Remember, we're huntsmen and huntresses. Coco reminded the gathering that she was still there with the hero girl by her side. It's our job to take on monsters, no matter what form they come in, be it by bigotry, bullying, or a bunch of bloodthirsty bastards in masks. There was a bunch of other murmurs in the crowd before they all seemed to swell into one resounding roar of approval, and in that moment Ruby saw a strong unity within her fellow students. Upperclassmen weren't acting superior to underclassmen. People from different kingdoms originally were together under the same roof. Even animosity between humans and the ones they used to call animals were forgotten. Beacon was truly united under one banner, all because of her. Ruby had united Beacon. She hated it. Clarity. You're back! The ballistic woman slammed into him before he could react. Those weeks away must have dulled his reflexes as well as his emotional shielding. Naruto stumbled but managed to hold his ground as Nila's arms wrapped around him and squeezed with at least thrice the strength her malnourished body indicated. Her ribs were pressed into his like the wooden bokken they practiced with, and to his increased ire she insisted on rubbing her cheek against his so thoroughly that he thought he might walk away with dark skin and she with whiskers. "Please let me go," Naruto began, not begged, before remembering something he had vowed to try before leaving the woods. "Nila." The entirety of Team Shiva took a step back and stared gapingly at the blonde as if he wasn't real. Lonan looked revolted and fevered like he was going to faint. Charna had an eyebrow cocked in curiosity, which was saying something for the normally expressionless Atlas native. Nilla, who was still steadfastly maintaining her grip, pried her face away from his just so she could scrutinize what was likely to be an impostor. If it was, she already had her poison-tipped nails around his neck. "Naruto, did you just say my name?" One of her eyes wide with surprise, the other narrowed until it was nothing but a crimson tracer lined up, showed on his forehead. With his kind of reaction, Naruto wondered whether it was worth it. Still, he was no longer being suffocated, so perhaps this was an improvement. "Yes." If possible, it was even quieter within the house. "Oh, this is the best day ever!" If possible, Nilla actually seemed to be rubbing against him harder, as if trying to include him in her multiple personalities. It was like being embraced by an octopus. When had her arms wrapped around his waist, and why did the number of limbs not add up? Nila, Naruto began only for the embrace to tighten another notch and restrict his airway. He was quickly resigning himself to the use of force for escaping the steely bind, but then he heard a whisper that was so soft and light he would have missed it had the ruby lips not been pressed against his skull. "Naruto." The quivering voice traveled up his jawbone, making him shiver involuntarily. It was so weak, so inconsistent with any of Nila's moods that for a moment he thought that it was she who was the impostor. "Naruto, I have to tell you something." "Nila, please let me go." The schizophrenic captain was about to snap at whoever had the nerve to interrupt this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, this moment she had been building up to for years now, only to come face to face with one of the people who had been by Naruto's side even longer, who had bled tears with her fellow captain where words could not be expressed, and suffered his lament palette of emotions since before most children learned finger painting. Sakura stared back patiently. She was right. Now was not the time. With a sigh, Nila disengaged, allowing Naruto to breathe like it was his first, and for as long as he'd been gone. And it honestly hadn't been that long, and it would take a good deal more time before the emotionally stunted assassin would be able to accept a confession like that. But the message here was clear. Nilla would get her chance eventually. As long as they all drew breath, there would be time before anyone could offer any more sentimentality, or even allow the blonde to catch his breath. Lonan cut them off. "So the Huntress," she prefaced, the teen trying to keep her expression as jaundiced as the rest of her corpse, as she examined her cracked knuckles lazily. "Did you get her?" "No," Sakura huffed, taking the hand she had placed on Nila's shoulder and fisting it, folding the loaded weapon into the crook of her arms before it could go off. "We didn't run into her during the evac, but believe me, if we did—" "I see." Nila nodded, understanding the woman's feelings. She too would disobey orders if it came down to it, though it was best not to say as much, turning back to the blonde who had not said much since being released from her personal incarceration. Nila wanted to confirm one thing from Naruto's own mouth. Just to be sure, this was the same huntress that's been a thorn in our side for the past few missions, correct? Being again forced to answer, Naruto looked back at his fellow captain and blinked under the intensity of her gaze. It was seldom that Danila would be so focused that she wouldn't switch in mid-conversation. From the middle of his cohorts, Naruto looked around cautiously. He saw that they were virtually all united in the same way, with an emotion he was reluctant to admit that he recognized and feared. While there were other variables that contributed to the mission's failures, the blonde began choosing his words as carefully as one chooses which wire to cut. Even if he had trouble emphasizing, he could understand the position he found himself in as either a peacemaker or poster child for vengeance. I cannot deny that she did have a part in our misfortune. He heard Namek Sakura snort behind him, but chose to ignore it. I see. Mila nodded once, and Naruto tensed as the wave of killing intent washed over him. In his diet over the past week of pacifism and positivity, he'd been temporarily overcome by the feeling of hatred. So the little huntsmen and huntresses think they can play with the big boys, huh? His fellow captain gave a depraved giggle as the more bloodthirsty side assumed control. She bit down on the tip of her thumb. The toxin she painted on her nails, numbing inhibitions at the same time it elevated other proclivities. Well, they are certainly welcome to come and try. The blonde noticed that the others were equally inviting eagerness, recognizing to him as a primal hunger in all their eyes. This was, after all, his pack. They're welcome to try like all the others before, and we'll show them why the assassins don't die. The unhinged woman withdrew her fingers from her mouth, saliva mixing in with the poison so that the demons she painted on them looked like they were shivering in anticipation within the hallway's dim light. Naruto's wasn't one for subtlety, but he picked something up in his captain's emotions that made him extend his senses, and though he couldn't see past his circle of comrades to peer into the darkness behind them, he could tell they weren't alone anymore. His own teammates tensed ever so slightly at the sudden and invisible instruction. Shiva, on the other hand, seemed to welcome their fellow assassins lurking to within the shadows, their leader spreading her arms wide as if trying to embrace all those wayward souls like she had her fellow captain, and they were all leaking like a sucking chest wound with killing intent. There was yet a camaraderie in it, mutual assurance of destruction. Assassins were taught at a young age that while teammates are important, the mission always came first. But the instinct for society, family was not so easily bred out, and this was something Naruto knew himself. What he did know, what he doubted anyone could have foreseen, was how his disappearance had thrown the dogma of the window. Although hadn't his sensei preached this very phenomena, yet he doubted this was what the this is what man intended. No, the killing intent was toxic, self-sustaining, like an uncontrolled nuclear chain reaction, and just as deadly and more so as it was focused, weaponized. And the target of theirs now had a face and a name, one that the rumor mills would surely spread across the entire base by the next morning. Jin or no, Ruby rose. Clarity. Ruby leaned against the tree, letting her head fall against the trunk as she looked down at the black mask in her hands. She didn't want to let the others, but she was now uncomfortable sleeping in the bed after so long on firm ground. At least that's what she told herself, so she could avoid the truth, which was more uncomfortable than the dirt floor. She had gotten used to sleeping next to him. Ruby felt her cheeks warm up against the cool night at the embarrassing thought before trying to shake it vigorously out of her head, succeeding only in making herself dizzy. She flopped over from the tree trunk and tried to focus on making the ground not move. Wonder when I'll see him again, she whispered. I hope. She cut herself off as thoroughly as Crescent Rose could the grass upon which she lay. She knew she couldn't have those kinds of thoughts. Should she? Maybe this was a test for her, a test for her conviction as a huntress. Maybe this was her chance to convince someone, or maybe she was letting her imagination run wild like she usually did. But unfiltered by the lights of the dark, by the day, her mind could wander through the field of dreams. Oh, this was going to keep her up all night if she didn't do anything about it. But what could she do? She wasn't the easy into sleep type. She was the sugar crash into unconsciousness type. Maybe she should go make some cookies and then binge them right now. That would help. It wasn't like she knew any other way that could keep her calm. Her eyes landed onto the mask. Or did she? Slowly the sleepless girl stood and stumbled/walked a few feet away from the tree, observing that she was far enough away from anything that might hinder her, and then she began to move. Each action flowed with the power and poise of a river, like the one they had left behind on that mountain. Her feet were like mountains supporting her trunk, sliding surely and inexorably along the ground. Ruby continued the kata she had learned out there, her mind now finally starting to relax in a state of calm, and as the minutes drifted by into hours past midnight, she never noticed the headmaster watching her from atop his turreted castle. Interested year indeed. Clarity. And finding himself in the assassin's library, Naruto scourged the shelves for books until at last, finding what he was looking for, he flipped through the pages, parsing over the practice combinations made for beginners, as well as more custom combinations that were beyond both his abilities and comprehension, not to mention budget. The procurement department was notoriously stingy. He read on, flying over leaves and leaves before the title of one chapter caught his eyes, and he dove in like a hawk. Weapons best fit for transformation into rocket launchers. He read aloud, half the words never having left his lips before today. As he recalled, rocket launchers also had other colloquial names. There was one in particular that was niggling at the back of his mind. Bazookas are awesome! Did he see stars just now? Perhaps he ought to get more sleep after all. Naruto let the memory from a different life play out in his head before closing the book on it. Looking down at the book in his lap, he turned past the title page and began reading. End of chapter 14.